Hi everyone, my name is Bev, and today I'm sharing my most disappointing reads of 2020. There are so many amazing books out there, so it feels really disappointing when you come across something that just ends up not being the greatest. They can't all be winners. If you identify at all with my reading taste and would like a heads up to some titles that maybe you won't enjoy, you are in the right place. Or maybe you completely disagree with me. I am absolutely here for that as well. I've got 5 books, well, one as a series, so technically 7 books to share that I found to be the most disappointing books that I read in all of 2020. In no way do I want to shit on somebody else's reading taste or hurt any feelings. This is totally just my opinion, and that is the nice thing about opinions. Everybody is entitled to their own. It's cool to disagree. In fact, I'm totally down for that. If you think I got any of these totally wrong, let me know in the comments down below, or just let me know what your most disappointing read was of the last year. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the list. Up top, I'm just gonna give you the series right now, and it is the Shades of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab. I've talked about this series at length. I did a whole reading vlog where I went through all 3 books and kind of gave my live reactions. So I'll link that here so you can see that as well. But because I've already spent so much time on this channel talking about a series that I ultimately did not enjoy, I don't want to spend too much time on a synopsis. It is essentially this fantasy series that takes place in multiple dimensions. One of the dimensions is our own, and it is actually set in 1800s London, but the majority of the story takes place in another dimension where magic is much more plentiful. The idea is there are just a small handful of magicians that are able to travel between these dimensions. Everybody else is just stuck where they are. There is a girl from our dimension, Lila Bard, who's a spunky misfit, and she gets thrust into this magical world. And for me, Lila Bard is the #1 most disappointing part of this whole series. For 3 books, we have to hear about how she's not like other girls, she's one of a kind, she loves knives, and it gets old quick. It's so surface level and honestly is not that great of a message to other girls who maybe feel like they don't fit in with a gender stereotype. Like, yes, the 1800s were a terrible time to be a woman, but the book series doesn't even go into that at all. I think that if they did, that would be infinitely more interesting and a lot less offensive. We are not going to glorify the not like the other girls mindset. We're not doing that here. Disliking this series was actually a big disappointment for me because it was kind of my first foray into a fantasy series, and I really thought that I was going to love it. I mean, it was super hyped on BookTube. I'll be honest, it did kind of put me off fantasy a little bit. I know logically that like one book or one series is not a good representation of a broad genre. Like no one book represents all of fantasy. So I read this series back in September and I didn't really pick up another fantasy until this month. So I'm really looking forward actually to sharing some of my fantasy reads in my December wrap up. So if you're not subscribed, make sure that you do so you don't miss out on that. So next up is the other book on this list that I have talked about before, and that is Shiver by Junji Ito. I talked about this primarily when I did a reading vlog with some other horror books, so if you are looking for some good horror recommendations, check that video out. The other books that I read in that video were complete gems. So Shiver is a horror manga collection. Each chapter is its own contained short story. Junji Ito is considered a master of the horror genre. His art is actually bone-chilling. It's kind of cool to read the book just for that, but really, just for that. I thought the stories were terrible. They all followed the same format, and that was something seems a little bit weird, and it gets weirder and weirder and weirder. The end. I mean, every single story ended unceremoniously with no reveal, no resolution. It was like, what? It felt pretty pointless. The other thing that kind of added insult to injury was that at the end of every chapter, Junji Ito has some text talking about how he was inspired for the art or for the story, and it was completely surface level every single time. It's so basic. Like, I had a dream about killer hot air balloons, so I drew it. Or one day, I had a thought that what if a really scary, ugly monster was a fashion model, so I drew that. Like, why include that? If anybody actually did enjoy these chapters, I feel like these author explanations would take away from that a little bit. So if you also think that Junji Ito's stories kind of suck, let me know in the comments if there are any good horror manga selections. Since Junji Ito is considered like the master of the horror manga, I don't know that I'm gonna pick up another one if this is supposedly the best of the best. I'd love to be proven wrong. Please let me know if there's something I should be checking out. Okay, these last 3 books I don't think I've talked about on this channel up to this point. So the next book is Fleischman is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. This book starts out following Toby Fleischman, who's just been recently divorced from his ex-wife and is on like an erotic escapade. He's swiping right, he's hooking up, he can hardly believe it. And then his ex-wife drops their kids off at his apartment off schedule and becomes totally unreachable. Toby spends most of the novel just irritated by this, but there are some things that suggest that something has gone wrong. That is sort of the wraparound story, but this book is actually incredibly character-driven and not very plot-driven, which wouldn't be half bad if I didn't find every single character completely insufferable. Toby is a twerp. He's a perpetual victim that has no ability to see where he's ever being wrong. His ex-wife is an image-obsessed social climber. Toby's friends are just obsessed with sex. Even his kids are really terrible. His youngest is a son that's essentially an insert of Toby as a child, so you kind of feel bad for Toby because you feel bad for his son. And his oldest is a bratty preteen girl that's supposed to take after her mother. The characters, uncool. The story, very boring. It ultimately doesn't amount to anything. At one point even, the narrator stops talking about Toby and starts talking about her own life like I care at all. Then towards the end of the novel, there's this like 11th hour change where we're no longer seeing things from Toby's point of view, and now we see them from his ex-wife's point of view. I think this is supposed to challenge the assumptions that the reader is making while going through the novel, and acts as some kind of social commentary forcing you to confront your problematic thinking. Except the message was actually really obvious the whole time and just comes across as completely patronizing. I listened to Fleischman is in Trouble as an audiobook, and that is 14 and a half hours of my life that I will never get back. On top of it not being a great book, it was unnecessarily long. This book was way too long to be saying so little. My next disappointment might be a little controversial, and it is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This book follows two weird sisters that live in their family home with their uncle after the rest of their family has died. The townspeople all think that they're freaks, and then a cousin comes calling, trying to make nice, seems like he's after some money, and then he starts pulling a little too hard on some loose threads. I thought this book was such a snooze. Shirley Jackson really put a lot into the atmosphere, but the plot was totally lacking. There were a lot of chapters that just felt completely plotless. And even in the moments where like a curtain is being pulled away for some big reveal, it just wasn't that shocking. The way people talk about this book, I was expecting to be like clutching my pearls in fear and surprise, and that is not what was going on at all. In reality, I could barely keep my eyes open. Like if I wanted to take a midday nap, I just cracked this baby open. I mean, this book was pretty short, like right around 200 pages, and it took me almost a month to finish it. Shirley Jackson is supposed to be one of the best horror writers of the 20th century, and I didn't find this to be a horror novel at all. The atmosphere is kind of eerie, I guess, but I wanted to be creeped out, so like I went into it trying to imagine, like, you remember those salad fingers videos?
I must find the perfect spoon.
I was trying to conjure salad fingers feelings while I was reading this book, but there's really nothing terrifying or nightmarish about it. The younger sister, Maricat, was one of the most boring protagonists ever. I didn't find her weird quirks intriguing at all. She just kind of seemed like a lonely kid, but we didn't really dive into that loneliness or do anything with it. So yeah, not a fan. I did spend a long time going through this book, but it was actually relatively short, so it has at least that going for it. And last on my list of disappointments is Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby. Samantha Irby is a comedic writer, and this is, I believe, her third essay collection about her life. Straight from the back cover, she talks about aging, marriage, settling down with stepchildren in white small-town America. I actually really like gross out humor and self-deprecating humor. Like Samantha Irby totally has my number with a lot of her stuff. I just felt like Wow No Thank You was extremely repetitive and one note. It was kind of the same punchline over and over and over again. I feel like I would have enjoyed this a lot more if I was reading it from like her Twitter instead of sitting down with a book. There were a few parts where she kind of takes you on a journey and then hits you with a gut punch of a really funny ending, but those were way too few and far between for something that was supposed to be a humorous essay collection. And that's another issue for me, is the fact that it was an essay collection. Each of the chapters stands alone, doesn't really connect to one another, and actually references other parts of Samantha Irby's life that I just didn't get. I think a big reason for that is that she's covered a lot of her life in previous collections, but in general, I've just come to realize that that format of essay collection or short story collection is just not my preferred way of taking in a story. Nonfiction, self-help, for sure, give me that format all day long, but when you're telling me a story, I really want to get taken for a ride and be given some payoff, and in Wow No Thank You, there is just no payoff. I do think that Sam Irby is a funny person and that she has had a really interesting life, but I don't feel like Wow No Thank You gave me enough of what I like. I have a working theory that maybe she used up a lot of her good material on her earlier collections, and while I just said that I don't love reading an essay collection, maybe I'll pick those up anyway and try something where like I just read one per week and really drag it out. I'm probably setting myself up for disappointment with that one. Like, I don't know why I would do that to myself, but like I said, I do think that Samantha Irby is super funny, and that is a huge reason why Wow Wow No Thank You was such a disappointment to me. If you're looking for palette cleanser, I highly recommend that you check out my last video on my most anticipated reads for 2021. This was a lot of negativity, so it probably wouldn't hurt to balance that out with some excitement. I'll definitely also be posting my 2020 favorites here pretty soon, as well as my December wrap-up, which is going to be pretty fantasy heavy, so make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any of that. Alright, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you for being here, and I will see you in the next video.